Hi listeners, and thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. Until March 2020, Fantasy Animation are delighted to be curating a series of screenings at the Cinema Museum, featuring Q&As with a variety of special guests, as well as a few live podcast recordings. Full details of each of the screenings can be found on the Cinema Museum website, that's www.cinemamuseum.org.uk. But for now, enjoy the show.
Hello listeners and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Alex Sargent.
And with me, Chris Holliday.
Welcome to your fortnightly guide on the worlds of paintings, drawings, stories and dragons. So this week we're doing Ex Machina, Chris.
We are. I'm very excited. I was just saying to you off air that these sort of post-human cyborg android movies haunt me, but in a good way. So I'm excited to sort of get my teeth into my into the circuitry of this film, I should say.
Oh, nice pun already.
You're welcome.
We're smashing it.
We're off and running.
But luckily it won't just be us two rambling on today. We have a wonderful special guest with us, Andrew Whitehurst, who is an experienced visual effects artist, has previously worked on Hollywood productions like Troy, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which we've done an episode on a couple of months ago.
We did.
So we'll have to talk to you about that at some point. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, and of course Ex Machina, which he, alongside his three collaborators, received an Academy Award for Best Effects in 2016. Andrew currently works as the creative director and VFX supervisor at Double Negative Studios here in London, and has supervised effects on other productions including Paddington, Skyfall and Spectre.
Skyfall, yes, obligatory bomb reference right at the start.
So Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
So, Ex Machina is a sort of brain teaser of a movie that sort of almost provokes conversation. So let's have one. I'd be interested to know, as a sort of opening preamble, how you came involved on the film, what role you served on it, and if you could just sort of give listeners a sort of up-to-date synopsis of your involvement on the project.
So I served as the visual effects supervisor on the film, and that role essentially means that anything that isn't shot in camera is my fault. And I was involved because Alex and his producers came to Double Negative, DNEG, who I work for, and they had written the script. Alex had written the script at that point, and he'd also worked with an amazing comic book artist called Jock to do some initial concepts. So when Alex came to us, there was a screenplay and there were some moody type concepts. So there was nothing very specific in detail, but this is the vibe of the piece. And that began a conversation between Alex and me about the kind of things that we would like to see in an android, and we then started the design process in earnest. We had to figure out a way of filming it practically, because it's a very low budget movie for that amount of visual effects work, so we needed to think about a lot of the practical considerations as well as the sort of aesthetics and the larger artistic concerns that we might have. And over time, we figured out a way of shooting the film efficiently and a way of designing a character that actually felt plausible in the world that was being described. And that took, 6 months or something. And then there was a 6-week shoot. And then we worked for a year and a bit afterwards to actually do the work.
So you're working with the raw material, you're working with the live action footage, and then you take this material and you feed into it, because one of the questions I had, one of the points I noted when I was watching the film is all the different kind of surfaces and reflective surfaces and spaces and things, and I was thinking all the time about your labour on the film and how all of this sort of comes together. And clearly it was a very challenging project, given, as you said, the budget that you were working with, but also the fact that there's, I guess, any shot with Ava in it, which is a lot of the movie is an effect shot, and so you're in it a lot, sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my involvement on a film, a visual effects supervisor will generally join a film very early in pre-production and is right there to when the project bleeds out and dies at the end. Really, it's only the producers, the director, and me who will be on the film for that run of time, because you need to have that involvement in pre-production to make sure that everything is designed in a way that we can shoot things when we get to the shoot give us the material to enable us to do the best job possible in post-production. So, I mean, I was there every single day of the shoot, and through pre-production and through post. But it was the complexity certainly is multiplied by the fact that Marco and Mish, who's the production designer and set decorator, do really like setting things in glass boxes.
Right.
So whenever you see Ava, you're generally also seeing reflections of Ava, which
Yep.
means we have to do the visual effects and the reflections. And not only do you have that, but often you'll have, if we're shooting through a piece of glass, you'll have a refracted Ava as well. So there's plenty of shots where when you think, oh, I'm looking at Ava, you're actually looking at 3 or 4 different Avas because we've had to do 3 or 4 different versions to account for all of the reflections and refractions that you're seeing. So the labour is pretty heavy. Also, Rob Hardy, the DP, likes to shoot with anamorphic lenses, and particularly 70s, 80s anamorphic lenses, which have a very beautiful, soft quality to them, and aesthetically are absolutely the right choice for the project because they have a gentleness that really contrasts strongly with the very rectilinear designs of the set and with the hardness of the robot. But they are very difficult to work with in post-production because they have a lot of quirks that we need to replicate in our CG. That means that there's an awful lot of looking at things and comparing them against the source material and go, oh, actually that bit should be a bit softer there, and there's some chromatic aberrations over here we need to copy, and.
Yeah.
And so there's this very forensic analysis that has to happen on every single shot to make sure that even once we've created a CG version of Ava, that CG version can then be blended seamlessly in with the photography.
I've got like 50 questions queued up in my head. If I can have 2, and then Chris, you can have your podcast back. So what you're saying there, a lot of bits about sort of the labour involved in creating the film. And in a film that's so much about sort of where we find human agency and things like that, it occurs to me that it sounds like there's a very lengthy pre-production on this thing that you were involved with, and then a very lengthy post-production. The production is 6 weeks. Right?
The shoot was 6 weeks.
So the first thing to note is how amazing it is that so many viewers focus on the fact that it stars some actors and all this stuff, when actually the labour is before and after. So I guess my first question would be, what were you doing in pre-production? I think I can get a handle on sort of what you might be doing in post, but what were you setting up in pre-production?
So pre-production is designing Ava.
Okay.
And the design of Ava is directly tied in with how do we film Alicia and what should Alicia be wearing on set in order for us to get what we need.
To come in later and
to,
edit the body and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly, to basically remove her body apart from her face, her hands and her feet, and replace everything with a CG version.
Yeah.
So there's a design aspect which is aesthetic and is story world driven. So I mean and with all of these and with all of these designs, there is certainly a temptation to go and look at other robots that have been done, and there is no shortage throughout cinema and comic book history. But the first rule I made for everybody, including me working on it, is nobody's allowed to look at robots. So what we did do is we looked at a lot of modernist sculpture, so a lot of sort of Constantin Brancusi, people like that. We looked at a lot of engineering where strength to weight is important, so things like racing car suspension, the frames on high-end bicycles. If you look at Ava's elbow joints, it's basically the bottom bracket off a very, very fancy high-end road bike in terms of shape and design and idea. And so we were looking at, okay, well, maybe the bones should be made out of carbon fibre because it's light. And we were looking, well, no, that doesn't really work because carbon fibre wears when you have bits rubbing against one another, so no, we should make that out of aluminium. All of those sorts of conversations have to happen because an audience, even if they're not an engineering audience, has a subliminal understanding of what a machine should look like if it is working properly. And I wanted to make sure that we didn't make something that was a cheat. So when we designed Ava, every single joint and every single muscle is in the right place to do the job that it does. And that serves 2 functions. One, it means that because it mimics what a human body does, we can put it in the positions that Alicia Vikander is capable of taking so that we will actually have plausible body shapes to match her performance. And the other reason is because it ties in with an audience's innate understanding of this feels right or this doesn't feel right. So when the muscles move and they bunch, which they do, you sense that. You don't you're not clocking it, you're not thinking about it. Similarly, we've got cables that run through the torso and through the limbs, and they have small amounts of jiggle in them when she's moving. And it's interesting because there were a couple of occasions where we would do a render, and that particular piece of animation, for whatever reason, had not simulated properly, and so it switched off. And suddenly the movement felt very leaden, and then we just ran exactly the same piece of animation in terms of the movement of the limbs, but with that secondary animation on top of it, and then the fluidity comes back. So it's looking for those details are ultra important. And the last reason for having to design her in a very, very conscientious, industrial designer kind of way is that there's a scene that's not in the finished cut of the film that takes place in the lab where Nathan and Caleb talk about the brain. And in the back of the lab, there is a gurney, and on that, there are all the pieces required to build another Ava. And there was another scene that took place in there that, as I say, isn't in the finished cut. But what it meant was that also in pre-production, a 3D print of the entire component set of parts required to build an Ava were printed out and chromed and all of the rest of it and laid out on that gurney. And they had to be able to slot together if we needed them to work properly. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why for a film like this, you can't do like you do on something like Transformers, which is a massive cheat because you just have all of these shapes that are interpenetrating and it doesn't matter because it's total fantasy. To make the character believable, you need to make her physicality believable.
I think you've just answered my second question, but I'll ask it anyway because otherwise I'm redundant. Which is, you've worked on films that high fantasy, explicit fantasy moves, and you've worked on a film like this, which is attempting some sort of level of realism, and a lot of what you're saying there is about getting it as realistic as possible. Are you conscious of the two genres in your work, and does it affect how you go about your creative process? Are you aware that, okay, this one needs to fit in with this kind of storytelling, so there's less of an onus on realism or anything like that?
You always have to be very aware of what has gone before in the work that you do. And that's either to try and reject it or to work with it and embrace it and perhaps extend it in some way. And certainly if you're doing something like Ex Machina, yes, I mean, you are trying to hit a very plausible, physically believable design. But, and this actually was something that I really only noticed after we'd finished the project and I was looking back on it, there is so much Mobius in Ava, and I'm a total Mobius nut, and Alex Garland is a total Mobius nut. And so I just think that subconsciously when we were working through designs and going, oh, that's actually appealing to us, and refining things, that whole background knowledge of Jean Giraud's work is just there, and I can't escape it. So I can try all I like, and I did my best to say we're not going to look at robots and we're going to do this properly and we're going to design this as if we were industrial designers tasked with building an android. But I can't escape everything that I've seen. I can't escape everything I've read. And I think it's a mistake too, because, again, an audience comes in with their prior experience and their knowledge, and you need to sort of tickle those parts of their brain so that they feel engaged with it. Because you could design something that is utterly other, and you can render. We now have the technology where we can render things where all of the materials behave in the correct way and the light is correctly simulated and so forth. And what that means is we could make a picture that says, if you had this thing and it was in this space, this is exactly what it would look like. But that doesn't necessarily chime with an audience as to something that actually feels plausible and believable. And a vast percentage of what we do in visual effects is psychology. If you actually look at a lot of old matte paintings, they are incredibly crude in terms of the amount of non-detail that's within them. But they're brilliant because what they do is where you need a little bit of detail, it's painted in, and where you don't, it's not there. And when it's shot on 35mm film, that's a little bit more forgiving than modern digital cameras and digital projection is. When you look at it, you are totally taken into this world because the person that's painted this knows what's important and has figured out that's what we need to create as an image that an audience will buy into. And that's them looking back through all of the history of painting. And we are then leveraging the entire history of painting, everything that traditional matte painting has taught us, and everything that we can bring to it as well. So we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. You can't not.
Sounds like genre almost works as a sort of force for believability in some ways. There's a cognitive theorist, Torben Grodel, who writes about sort of the relationship between cognitive psychology and the supernatural, and talks about sort of how supernatural imageries often play on our habitual reasoning as much as our cognitive reasoning. So things make sense because they've been like this rather than things have to be like this. And it sounds like genre expectations, genre iconographies.
I don't think it's even a genre thing. I mean, it's an anything involving imagery thing. We are so inundated with imagery, which is almost all created from a Western art sensibility over, when do we start getting perspective right? Let's say about 1200 and something. From then on, all of that feeds into what we do now. And again, to take another film that I worked on with Alex, Annihilation, there's a humanoid figure at the end of that film. And for that, we went and looked at a lot of art made by other cultures as to how they had represented the human form, and particularly found a lot of inspiration in Cycladic sculpture, so very, very old Greek sculpture. Not that the finished thing looks like that, but you look at these things and it taps into something that we have just buried deep in our subconscious because of the way we've been experiencing imagery our entire lives. And a lot of that's then passed down from the way our parents and their parents experience things. So there is, any time you're making any piece of art, you are always referencing, generally leveraging what has gone before. There is nothing new under the sun, but there is mixing and trying different things, and that's what we try and do.
It seems like you had obviously a lot of, you have your role on the film, but then you're bringing in all these other subject areas and topics and experiences, and it seems like you actually have to play a lot of roles because you're having different kind of creative hats on at any one time. Obviously, the film, and maybe we'll get to this, but obviously the film itself has a sort of surrogate creator within it, of course, whose intentions become the sort of stuff of narrative, which is interesting in and of itself. But the way that Nathan describes search engines, that scene you were talking about, search engines and the human mind, talks about impulse response, fluid, imperfect, patterned, and chaotic. So that sort of that pullback from the real. What's interesting, I think, when you were talking about movement, and that there's something in the way that Ava will move that will just read, even subconsciously to an audience, it won't be flagged up as an quote-unquote an effect, but will be something that will allow the spectator to register a certain impression of reality. A lot of writing, certainly within visual effects, or even computer animation and computer-generated imagery, is that we've reached the point where, okay, so we know that things aren't real and that there is no indexical one-to-one relationship between what's in front of the camera. We know that computers can create. What we now need to do is think about how we understand realism by moving, to quote the title of an article by Tom Gunning, thinking about reality and CGI by moving away from the index. And his main thing is movement. Movement's like the key thing. It doesn't really matter what the object looks like in terms of texture or voice or something like this. It's actually the movement of the character. So it seems that's exactly what you can make this. In this case, Ava is on the human side of fantastical creatures, if you like. But there is something quite interesting about the anchorage that movement provides in a character that nobody knows what a dinosaur looks like. Everyone knows what a human looks like and how they move. And so you've got a real... It's more of a challenge. That's the thing that visual effects artists and animators say. It's more of a challenge to do humans because we know what they look like and how they move.
Particularly with faces, we can't do humans yet.
Yeah.
And the aspect of humans which we can do is it is totally possible to create an utterly photoreal head. That problem, if it can be defined as a problem, is solved. Making it move is astonishingly difficult. And the reason why it's astonishingly difficult is because the way your face actually moves is your brain comes up with some sort of impulse, which then pushes muscles around in your face, which then pushes fat, which then pushes the fascia under the skin, which then moves the skin around to give you a recognizable smile. What in visual effects we are trying to do is reverse engineer that. So we want to be able to say recognizable smile, but the way animation works is that you then push the face around to get that shape. So you can probably create a pose that is indistinguishable from reality, but then when you're trying to move to another facial shape, that's when you hit problems. And the way that most facial animation works is it's actually founded on psychological work. So there's a set of facial shapes called the FACS set, F-A-C-S. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But it's a set of about 32 different facial shapes. If you imagine making an extreme ooh shape and smiling as widely as you can and raising your eyebrows, that kind of thing. And the reason it was come up with was so that psychologists could look at the facial movement of people with very different physiognomies and be able to create a data set of what their face is doing for any particular stimulus that is actually in numbers rather than sort of trying to take a wild stab in the dark at looking two completely different faces. And what we do is we create those fact shapes and we then blend them together to try and create a facial performance. The problem with that is it looks like what it is, which is a mixture of a pre-existing set of facial shapes. And we try different things about adding some sort of skin simulations on the top of it, but we have not cracked it yet. And my personal take, and this is entirely my take, is I think until we utterly redefine the way that we are trying to do facial animation, we're not going to get there.
It seems there's so much in this film that is about, we say this at the podcast every single time we record an episode, it's on our ban list, but so much of this is about the process that it was required to make this story, right? And there's so much of the film reflects on these issues.
Well, that's why it's Alicia's face. There's only one shot in the film where there's a bit of CG face, and that's the bit where she gets her arm knocked off, and that's because when we were filming it, Alicia had her real arm in front of her face, and she was disinclined to allow us to saw her actual arm off.
Yeah, seems fair, you know.
These performers are just...
It's not method enough.
No,
but
no.
But that's the only bit where we actually had to rebuild some face. And the reason for that is certainly on a movie with the budget of Ex Machina, we do not want to go anywhere near trying to create a CG facial performance, because if you are going to try it, the thing that you need is masses of time and a lot of people, because it's unbelievably labour intensive to do it well.
In terms of the kind of context for the film, before we sort of, I guess, move into it in earnest, is you mentioned obviously that your reference points not being other robots, but what was striking certainly for me is obviously this film. I wouldn't say that it comes out at a time where there are a cluster of maybe that's right, that there are a cluster of movies or movies that are about these sorts of themes, and I think one of the things that I suppose we think about in this podcast is the ability of animation to do fantasy or to be able to do these things. And obviously, if we think about films, so when I was watching it, I was thinking of this treatment of posthumanism versus a film like Chappie from 2015, or Her, or Under the Skin, or ways in which there is this collision between humanity and the machine, or biology and technology. And so I guess from my perspective, I just wondered, were you conscious that there was something resembling, again, I'm not going to say movement, but were you aware that there are other movies coming out within 2 or 3 years, or that you were thinking, okay, so we're part of maybe there's a broader sort of cultural moment where we're thinking about, the post-Siri age, where we can now talk to, I don't know, I just wonder whether that was part of, were you conscious of that sort of trend, if you like?
Honestly, no. You tend to be, making films, it requires a lot of time and mental effort and attention. So you tend to be very myopic when you're working on a movie. And I really was not aware of much else going on at the cinema at that time, because, to be honest, if I've spent a whole day working on a film, I don't really want to go and watch another one. Yep. I'd rather go home and draw or play guitar or something. Yeah. So, and I'm not alone in that. I mean, I think most people would say they have other things that they need to do to stop them going bonkers when they're right in the midst of making a film. So no, but I think that certainly when Alex and whoever wrote the other films is writing on things, you know, the thing that is tickling their brain and making them go, oh, actually, maybe there's a story in something around
these are a
here
set
somewhere.
of themes that we can work with. Yeah.
Exactly, it is drawn from the world which surrounds them. I mean, which is always the case with science fiction. You know, I mean, it's about now. It's not about the future, and that. So I think it's in the writing stage. Certainly, I mean, when whoever's writing these things, yes, I mean, if there is a zeitgeist, I guess that they are all plugged into it because they are culturally aware people at a particular point in time.
Technology is doing things that
Exactly.
they might want to respond to. Yeah.
But once we're involved, honestly, no.
Interesting.
Is the paradox to that, though, that perhaps the zeitgeist is caused by, you know, the work that you guys do in a respect, and that you're getting so close
yes,
to
you
sort
do.
of blurring the lines?
I mean, it was interesting that for a sort of a solid 18 months after Ex Machina came out, every single newspaper article about artificial intelligence used to steal from Ex Machina as its image. So, I mean, yes, I mean, you know, pop does eat itself.
Yeah.
So you become this sort of, this feedback loop with the culture. So you're kind of creating and feeding off at the same time. And that's...
But I think that ties back into what I was saying at the beginning about banning everybody from looking at robots, because I do have a big issue when, and this is something that genre struggles with a lot, is very, very incestuous aesthetics. And I will often work with concept artists, let's say, whose only reference is other concept art. And you can say, well, what about, you know, Caravaggio, or what about the way that the cave drawings in Chauvet Pont d'Arc, or whatever? They have no idea. They know other concept art from other movies. And so when you look at a lot of sci-fi fantasy movies, the thing that you are looking at is this continual digestion and redigestion of imagery from the same genre, and that I really do try and fight against.
Yeah,
it's like, which is not to say I am claiming any originality here. I'm just trying to say that we ought to cast our nets a little wider in terms of the cultural references which we should be drawing on to help produce our work.
If any of my students are listening right now, just listen back to what was just said there.
Yeah.
Anyway,
but I like the idea of the way that genres and genre theory work, and these sorts of kind of continuities and differences, and this is how same but different. This is how genres work. But it's that incestuousness of it is interesting, because then the genres or the additions to the genre are not necessary. They're not repeating these same generic elements. They seem to be kind of copying, or they're representations of representations, and suddenly you get this sort of quite abstracted idea of what genres actually are. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about something like Ex Machina, as this real interdisciplinary space where you're drawing from different reference points. I'm sure the same thing goes on in certain kinds of animation studios, where they're not just interested in the history of Hollywood animation from 1937 onwards. What they're interested in is a sculpture or something like that, where they're pulling in all these different influences. So I think and certainly, as we said, in a film that's about creation, and very explicitly so, these characters are talking about the thought processes and talking about authenticity and believability, and how machines can work like humans, and how you can convince one. And I find that kind of process of individuation, becoming human, works on both counts. Actually, and what I think is interesting about the film, it's as much about Caleb's individuation as it is Ava's, and actually who's interviewing who. And one of the final, we might as well jump ahead to the final.
Sure.
One of the final bits of the movie is this very famously the sort of final session, where it's not a session at all. You know, Ava session 7 was not there's no session going on here. So I find that was when the haunting for me kind of began in earnest, because I find it kind of fascinating.
Okay, I'm just going to interrupt that pre-recorded conversation that's happening through a microphone.
For another pre-recorded conversation that's happening through a microphone.
Yes, to advertise a non-pre-recorded conversation that will be happening live in person in a real place in a real space.
So this is now let me get this right, this is the live at the Cinema Museum Fantasy Animation screening series, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know about you, Chris. I like these podcasts, but I sometimes wish that I could just see people stand on stage, say things, and then perhaps watch a movie afterwards.
Is there a Q&A involved?
Sure, why not? And maybe we we can get involved maybe some animators, some academics, and some other experts in the world of fantasy animation to talk about the movies and introduce them, and then stick around for a Q&A.
So this seems like a good idea, but surely such an event can't be happening.
Well, don't you worry, it is. It'll be happening all throughout 2019 and into 2020. There'll be once a month towards the end of the year, and you can find all information on the Cinema Museum website. That's cinemamuseum.org.uk. It's in London and in the Kennington area, so people need to be probably based in London or around that neck of the woods, or super keen to come down, in which case we'd love to have you.
And what kind of films can potential audiences expect as part of this screening series?
What about Shrek, the CGI 2001 DreamWorks satire?
Sounds like something I would have chosen.
Sounds like something you'd have chosen indeed.
What about any Ralph Bakshi?
I don't know, that sounds like something I'd chosen, but why not? Why don't we throw in a Wizards from 1977?
Maybe something to tie into the very recent Dark Crystal series. Maybe something, involving the Beatles and Yellow Submarine.
Well, that would be great, because there are previous podcasts on that. We could talk all about that.
We could talk all about all those things. So if you like the Fantasy Animation Podcast and you'd like to see us do it live and in the flesh, come along to the Cinema Museum back end of 2019 into 2020 and get involved in the conversation.
Tickets will be priced at £6. You can find all the information on the Cinema Museum website. We'll be having guests that will be confirmed nearer the time, but the first few screenings are already taking place, and you can find all about them. Please do come along. We'd love to see you.
But for now, we should get back to the show.
Sure.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about all these kind of... There seems to be this repeated, creative... Disjunct's not the right word, something more productive than that. But there's lots of movies where there's a technological innovation taking place on screen, framed around a narrative that is scared of the technological innovation that's taking place on screen. And I just, as a creator whose actual job in this movie is to get the technology working well, in a film that's worried about what happens if you get the technology working too well, does that in any way sort of feed into the process at all? Are you aware we're making this, that basically, if you're in this movie, you are the baddies,
Not so much. I mean, I think with Ex Machina, the hard bit of doing the film is copying Alicia's movements well enough. The making of something that looks real in a single frame is comparatively easy. And I say that because I've been doing this for 20 years, so I have a vague idea what I'm doing by this point.
I'll give it a go.
Well, I mean, go for it. But the hard bit is the human bit. And that actually, I think, feeds also going back into prep. When I was talking with Alex and Rob Hardy, the DP, and they were very, very nervous because, and understandably so, because really what Ex Machina is as a film is a series of conversations. And they're all a series of conversations between two people. And if those scenes, when you cut them together, do not work as a piece of drama, it doesn't matter what we do in visual effects, you are screwed. So we had to come up with a way, when we were designing how we were going to shoot the film from a visual effects standpoint, that meant that Alex and Rob can shoot as if they were shooting any other piece of drama. And that's for them, and that's for the actors. Because you need that connection to happen between those two actors, because that's what gives you the plausibility. And then we work with that to try and add our extra, however many percent, on top of that. So it's the human aspect that's the difficult bit. It's not the technical aspect, and the bit that's difficult is in copying of the movement, and that just requires artists with a tremendous amount of patience and sensitivity to really look at how the movement is, duplicating it, watching it back hundreds of times and going, no, that doesn't feel quite right, this bit doesn't feel quite right, let's tweak this, let's adjust that. And we're talking sub-pixel levels of accuracy here. So that's the hard part. The hard part is the emotional, human, psychological part. The easier part is does this look like a chrome robot in a lab?
Whose performance is Ava on screen then?
Alicia, 100%. So generally the way it usually works with most CG characters is that you will either do motion capture, where the performance is actually digitally encoded and then given to an animator, or you body track the performance, where you have a digital mannequin that you frame by frame put in the same places as the actor, which is how Ava was done. But ordinarily, there will be an animation pass where an animator will finesse what the actor's done to make the movements more fluid or more beautiful. And again, this was one of the decisions we made up front was, no, we're not going to do that. It's like, what we're going to do is we're going to do the absolutely copper-bottomed best bit of body tracking that has been done. And we know this is going to be brutally hard work, but it's going to be worth it because every single movement that you see is exactly what Alicia did. And then that performance and that every single joint and movement copied, and then that put into our rig that is our robot, and then our robot moves around in exactly the same way as Alicia did. So what you see in terms of walking, gesturing, everything is 100% Alicia Vikander.
That's a really fascinating answer. We did an interview a few episodes back with an animator from Aardman talking about pirates, and a lot of the conversation was about performance and how he saw his animation as a performance. He is performing the pirate captain whilst animating, but that's very different to what you've just described there. So you wouldn't see what you're doing as a performance.
No, absolutely not. I mean, there are plenty of jobs where we certainly do the performance, but this, again, because it's this, every single scene is this delicate conversation between two people. Every gesture, every subtle movement matters. You know, there is a shot in Ex Machina which was an absolute swine to do. It's 1,600 frames long, so it's over a minute. And it's a mid-shot of Ava holding up a drawing to Caleb and talking, and at the end she puts the drawing down, gets up and walks away. It took a tracking artist 3 months to track that shot. And he did nothing else in that time other than track every single tiny movement of Alicia's hand against the paper, everything, to get it just right. But that's what it takes, because that's what the performance is in that scene. And if the movement was something else, when you looked at it in the edit, it wouldn't feel right. It's not. The performances are captured on the day, and the performances are what the actors are giving to the camera, based on where the camera is in that particular time for that particular take. That's what the magic is. That's the human connection. That's the thing that we needed to capture and hold on to. If we're doing something else where you're doing another character, like I don't know, let's say the bear in Annihilation, that's entirely animated. You know, we didn't have a bear. We particularly didn't have a bear with a limp, but we thought, you know, this creature. We know how to do this. I had a very skilled team of animators. We talked through what the psychology of the scene is, in that it wants to be this creature which is terrifying in its power, but also has a vulnerability because it's this sick animal. So which again, I guess, adds to the terror because of, you know, there's nothing more dangerous than a wounded animal. But that is an entirely creative performance. That performance is ours in as much as it's entirely created in visual effects. In Ex Machina, the performance is Alicia's.
Yeah, okay, so there's a crucial element of the human going on again here. So maybe actually this disjunct that I...
Well, I don't know with that, because I think, I don't think it is, it's not the humanity. I mean, if you look at something like Spider-Man Into the Spideyverse, the humanity of all of the performances in that movie is incredible. I mean, you just feel every single character so deeply and their humanity. They're not photoreal humans. I mean, aesthetically, I love everything about that film. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. But the performances are very, very human, but they're animated. So it's not the humanity, I think, that's it's the thing that is different between Ex Machina and anything else I've worked on in regard to what you're saying, is that it's the delicacy and the intimacy of those conversations. And it's because it's a very measured film where the camera moves very slowly, the takes are very long, you get to really look and spend time with the cast. And what they are bringing is what gives you the tension. You know, that's the magic in terms of the humanity there. So there's nothing we can do to add. I mean, we could do a lot to detract from it, but our job was to turn an actor into a robot whilst maintaining every aspect of her performance as best we could.
I think it's interesting, these questions around performance within a digital context, where we talk about ownership, and I like the idea that performance belongs to certain people or certain components rather than the creative. Maybe it's defined spheres of labour. Maybe that's what it is, creatively defined spheres, different ways in which we might allocate and think about the ownership of performance. But it seems to me that that's really that's what the film is about, because they talk quite explicitly at the start. Nathan talks very explicitly about Caleb being the human component within this set of tests that will kind of structure the movie. These 7, if you like, 6 proper, but 7 really kind of sessions. Yeah. But I think the thing about movement and conversation, this is obviously a very performance-centred film. It's very theatrical, I think, in that respect, that it's anchored to these series of conversations. But crucially, because the conversations themselves are supported by the ideas of suspicion, that's what makes it really important, because Caleb almost instantly kind of rubs up against Nathan in a particular kind of way and is suspicious. And I think it's only I think it's the second session when Ava reveals that she doesn't believe that Nathan can be trusted. So already you have these themes of suspicion. So it is conversation-centred, but it has to be, because it seems like all the character relationships become a series of tests, and people aren't quite sure the person that they think that, and this goes back to this point about individuation, who's the subject and who's the master and who's the kind of subject. There's that sort of thing, and that's what I really liked about the film, that it was suspicious. The characters were suspicious of each other. Humans were suspicious of technology, and obviously that sort of scene where Caleb is cutting himself to reveal that he is actually biological rather than technological is like a key moment, and it's sort of that's the threat, and whether the individuation is connected to paranoia, that he's paranoid that he might be one of them. So I think you absolutely like that kind of the conversations that structure the film, the fact that I hadn't really thought about the long takes, but absolutely, and also the way in which the characters move, or in some cases don't move.
Yeah.
So Caleb isn't really moving when he's giving, and that's why he felt like a subject rather than the person kind of creating.
No one's really moving very much.
But it seems like Ava's the one. She at least move or paces maybe a little bit more.
But I think that's an interesting, and that ties in with very, very clever piece of production design, because the obvious way of designing that set is that Ava is in a glass box, and then your interviewer has the freedom of the space. But that's not the way it's laid out. That your interviewer is the person who emerges into this sort of protective glass box, and then the interviewee Ava has the space to walk around. Yeah, which is a very interesting way of turning on its head what you might naturally expect that relationship to be, and also that then ties in with when you see Ava go into her bedroom, and you see that there is that big glass window with this tree beyond it, but it's still contained within this sort of light well. That's when you realise how cruel Nathan is, in as much as here's all of the stuff you can't have, and it's just on the other side of this glass, and you can't have it.
Then I suppose it then gets reversed again, because given that the climax of the film is about her ultimate, given that she spent this entire film as somebody who is constructed within a space that is constructed and layered and has glass partitions, which has the element of frustration built into the design of the space itself. That's then reversed at the end when Caleb becomes and so again it becomes turned on its head again, and then she has the freedom to. And what I really liked about the film were these sorts of like pillow shots where suddenly we're outside and you have a conversation that takes place outside, and then we're back in again, and it's kind of claustrophobic and but then there's this expanse that you can't quite see or don't quite understand. I know we've jumped to the end, but I find the film fascinating.
No, I think I spent a lot of time thinking about the sort of the relationship between sort of the way the film taps into issues of sort of gender identity and all this kind of stuff, because I think that's such an important.
It's massive. I mean, it's a film. It's a film about two things. It's a film about how much do we understand about human consciousness? Answer: not very much. And how does our culture look at women in their 20s? And the answer to that is often in a not very healthy way.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Could you talk more about that and what the conversations involved in that kind of side of the production?
Well,
Was Alicia kind of on before you then designed the robot? Do you design the robot around her, or because I suppose that's part of her?
The initial designs were done before Alicia was cast, and then once she was cast, we made adjustments.
Yeah. Her casting
because of her physicality.
Yeah.
For sure. But it's, I mean, the thing that, and I think it's one of the strongest aspects of the film, which ties into this whole looking at gender, and particularly the way we look at young women, is no one, I think, when they first watch Ex Machina, in the opening scenes, thinks that Ava is naked. Then Ava puts on clothes, and then Ava takes off her clothes again, and now you see her as naked. Nothing has changed, but everything has changed because of the way that we are used to, in so much of the imagery we see, seeing people wearing not very much or nothing at all. And what that does to us psychologically, I think, is very well explored by that particular part of the film.
And a lot of that requires the design of Ava, right? Which be fascinating to hear sort of what the decisions were, what you sort of threw around, what ideas were chucked out along the way, because that the robot, for want of a better term, body has to do a lot of things, and there has to be a sort of line the film treads between evoking the eroticism that it's trying to discuss, and I've googled sort of interpretations. I read a few reviews last night, and I think that the interpretations are pretty split into what to read into the movie, which is people's prerogative. But I think on one level, which I suspect is the reading Alex was going for, is that this is a film about sort of a post-human feminism where Ava is liberated, rises up, and sort of becomes a sort of emancipated woman as a result of the misogyny around her, right? And then another reading is almost like the film's having its cake and eating it, and that there is an element of latent eroticism in the design of Ava. So I thought I'd throw those two interpretations out there and see what you thought
certainly
about
the former is the intent. I understand the criticism of the latter. But I think the reason why Ava is designed the way that she is that from looking at it from the psychology of Nathan, the creator, is he needs to make something which, I mean, partially maybe does something for him, but also he wants to try and persuade another heterosexual male that they want to have feelings about this entity. I mean, I don't even know really whether we could honestly describe Ava as he, she, or Ava is Ava. And in order to do that, it needs to push certain buttons for Caleb, who you generally get the impression from other lines of dialogue is perhaps not the most emotionally sophisticated of people. But Caleb is also representative of our culture as well. And that is the way that we tend to look at women, which is also then why when you have the scene at the end with all of the other androids hanging up in the closet in Nathan's bedroom, which is beyond twisted, that's why. That's why that's there. It is a very strident criticism of the way that we look. It is the male gaze personified. I mean, the fact that one of the robots that's hanging up, the body is built in exactly the same way as the cover of the female eunuch, is not accidental.
So I guess if we're thinking about that there are two, I mean, the cast of the film is, if we exclude those kind of hanging women up, it's very small, and that's what I think makes it very, as you said, very kind of theatrical and performance and dialogue heavy. I suppose for all intents and purposes, it's Nathan who is the villain. He's the CEO of this company, and he, as you say, he's creating these androids for certain reasons that we're not quite sure of. And part of our alignment, I think, with Caleb is to try and he goes on a sense of discovery and finds out. But then it seems like the film is also criticising him, given that we don't really get much of his backstory. He wins the lottery straight away.
But you team Caleb?
But this is the thing. This is the thing. Is that the film sets that up as he's this outsider who's kind of coming, and he's being victimized because the revelation is that he's the one that's being
he's
duped.
not being victimized. I mean, he is as complicit as Nathan is, because he's only interested in getting Ava out, not for Ava's emancipation, but because he basically wants to get off with her.
Yeah.
And which is why I have no problem with him being locked in an office at the end of it.
Because one of the sort of, I suppose, revelations at the end is that Ava has been designed with his search history in mind. And so desire structures the design of her as a character.
Exactly.
And so, no, absolutely. But what I thought was interesting is that I was ready for the film, certainly for the first 30 minutes, to not be that. I thought it was going to be, okay, so he's going to rescue her and it'll be wonderful. And clearly Nathan is being framed as a villain who drinks too much, who lives his life to excess, who gets hungover, and there's a party. There's no party. He just gets drunk. But you're right that actually I wouldn't say it flips it, but it makes them both complicit in the same, a different kind of exploitation of post-human identity.
Yes.
And so that's what I think the film...
and human identity.
And human identity, exactly. So and so it's as much about the human component in the film, i.e. the film is about an android, but actually it's not. It's as much about the human reaction to that and the different kinds of human reactions.
It is entirely about the human, because we have no way of knowing what a non-human consciousness would be, and there's not really. There is aesthetically and narratively a lot less that you could do by trying to represent a non-human consciousness than to represent a human consciousness in another form that says to us that this is how little we understand about who we actually are. Everything about the relationships, about the interactions, about the levels of self-awareness or not in that film is entirely human.
There's something quite interesting, and maybe this is actually a question for Alex. There's a reference to Alice in Wonderland about Through the Looking Glass, and I have a question, which is why. I just wonder whether the film does that chime with. It's an explicit gesture to fantasy, and the film is actually very literate and talks about quotations and reference points, and that's one of your quotations, an attribution. And so, Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also, I would argue, the opening setup is an allusion to Willy Wonka. No, the golden ticket, winning the competition, going to visit the and showing you the tricks behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff. To me, the film is playing with fantasy, and I think is that the third party that we're not talking about here in this complicit relationship is the audience, right? In that the film, to me, sets up you think the film's going to be a Turing test where you are Caleb trying to work out whether Ava is human or not, and then flips that. But in order to do that flip, it has to get you thinking. You mentioned the male gaze. Well, the male gaze is a theory of spectatorship. It's of what the audience is doing as much as what's happening on screen. We have to think what Caleb is doing is what we are doing at the same time. There's have to be that alignment, and I think that's where the film plays with the audience quite nicely. So I think there Ava has to be eroticized because it would be wrong to say that those first 20 minutes aren't trying to eroticize it in a way that then pulls the rug under you.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean, yes. I mean, that is absolutely the case, and it's done with the eyes open.
Did you talk about that? in the
absolutely.
process?
Yes, I mean, there's and again, it's sort of there's a moment where Kyoko, who's the other character we should talk about, I guess, is lying on a bed in the room where all of the other androids are hung up in the cabinet. And I don't think it's the take that ends up in the film, but there was one where we set it up so it looked like Manet's Olympia, which again, if you're going to look at the history of art and the male gaze, is a very profound example of that, and probably the beginning of modern painting. So the illusions are all there, and I would say most of them we understood whilst we were filming it. Inevitably with a film, there are things and there are themes that you find out whilst the edit is happening. You go, okay, actually that's a thing, isn't it? Okay, right, well we need to rework this in order to put that in. Not so much with Ex Machina, that was more straightforward in the way that it went together, if memory serves. but it's all of the things that you're describing were certainly very much front and center in terms of discussion before we shot anything and whilst we were shooting it. I mean, it's what the film is about.
I think on the topic of Kyoko, this sort of in-house mute, or at least a character who we are told does not speak any English, but is ultimately revealed to be an android. I guess one of the things that the film does very well is this sort of yes, it plays with believability and authenticity, but also this kind of the revelation. And so Kyoko is like a character where her body, and I'm gesturing, but this sort of where the body components get peeled off, and the layering of humanity, and part of Ava's individuation as a female, if we say very broadly, but as an android who looks female, or looks like Alicia Vikander.
Yes.
Is her acquisition, her kind of physical acquisition of skin or something that resembles skin. So you've talked a little bit, I mean, were they moments that you worked, those sorts of, we've talked about what happens under the skin, if you like, but the kind of revelation of these sorts of layers. And so
absolutely.
what was going on with that?
Well, there's a lot of conversation that we had, and we did a lot of design work in thinking about how the skin should be applied, what sort of shapes the panels of the skin should be. Should they be have very straight edges so that they felt more mechanistic, or should they feel like actually sort of torn flesh that was being reapplied? And in the end, we went more with the former, because the magic is only complete when the last panel is in place, and then suddenly the whole is the pupation is complete. And that's something that is, again, is in the screenplay. We designed a whole bunch of it up front. We storyboarded it a lot to try and figure out, well, what are the angles that we can shoot that are going to best sell this idea or best explain this idea. And the whole scene begins with her with Ava taking the arm off one of the other androids and reattaching it to herself, which is a profoundly non-human thing to do ordinarily. So it's to go from this surreality and through the mechanism of applying these patches of skin to then transform Ava into something which is physically, at least on the surface, indistinguishable from human, but because of what we've gone throughout the rest of the film, it's like, well, was she not human before? Is she human now? Is she still not human? It is just a visual way of exploring the idea that is dualism a thing? Whole mind body thing, is that a thing? Yeah. It's just like, is our essence entirely contained within our brains, or is the physicality a big part of that or not? Which I think, and I haven't read his book, but Murray Shanahan was somebody that Alex talked to a lot when he was writing, and I think that's one of Murray's big areas of research, is into sort of the physicality of artificial intelligence processes.
But I suppose themes of kind of consciousness and embodiment are, as you say, it's like these are themes that allow you to play visually, and so actually the dislocation of her arm, Ava's arm, when she sort of this kind of bodily substitution and physicality and those sorts of things provide a nice contrast to those kinds of scenes where Caleb cuts himself to reveal his humanity, but also Nathan's ultimate kind of demise and the way that his body works under certain kinds of duress. Because we see in the scene that you mentioned earlier that involved a bit of facial simulation where Ava's arm is in front of her, where her arm gets sort of, or her mechanical arm gets sort of cut off, fused and stuff. You have that scene. You have a scene where an earlier version of Ava is banging on the glass walls and her arms, which is again a nice parallel to Caleb when he's trying to cut through the glass. But that's how those kinds of bodies perform under that kind of duress versus... Well, and it seems like they're quite durable bodies ultimately because parts can be interchanged, whereas these kind of humanity is ultimately frail and will just...
But I think it's the reaction of the individual. So when Ava's arm is smashed off, she doesn't seem to suffer pain.
Yeah.
It's more sort of surprise and, okay, I don't quite understand what's just happened there. and then with a reasonable degree of nonchalance swaps the arm out for another arm, which is something that to us is a much bigger conceptual leap, because we suffer pain and we are very attached to our limbs, and therefore when if someone loses it and has some sort of prosthesis, there is a big psychological aspect to that change in your life. Whereas for her, I guess because she knows no different, it's a different thing. Now, does that make her non-human? I guess so. But does that matter? I don't know.
I suppose it then sets up this issue of empathy towards the end. Like if the film's final act is to place her consciousness within a series of decisions, i.e., she's very physical, and actually I think that fight scene, I was going to ask actually about the sort of her fight sequence with Nathan is very, that is like a feat of kind of compositing, because you've got all these and they're fighting and so that seemed to be I would imagine quite an interesting and kind of challenging scene to work on, because you're his body and her body, and he flips around and comes on top of her and that sort of thing. But then her consciousness and ability to make decisions is then when she then gets up to leave, she dresses herself both in skin and then in clothing, and then leaves Caleb behind this glass, and there's sort of like a series of reactions that aren't reactions at all, or sort of blank looks, and there's a smile I think when she's out.
I think the smile is the key, because it's the only time in the entire film where we see Ava on her own, where she is not reacting to anyone else. So if we are wanting to make an argument that Ava has consciousness that is in some way human, that is the one shot, because it's her reaction to her environment, and it's a reaction that's just for her.
Yeah, because obviously, given that the as you said, the film is structured around these conversations and is sort of centered through dialogue, her ability to obtain consciousness is always going to be in reaction or in response to a conversation that she's having with other characters and stuff. Yep. And so I wondered whether her consciousness comes from her reaction with other characters, so she doesn't know her body as well, so when her arm gets knocked off, she's sort of, I wasn't expecting that. So she's perhaps more conscious of other bodies than she is her own. But then ultimately that smile at the end, as you say, signifies a moment where she's thinking autonomously, independently, without a human the other side of the glass. And so I think that's sort of a brief, it's very, very brief, but it's a release of sort of human jubilation, I guess.
I wanted to bring the conversation round to me, there seems to be two effects going on here, actually, and we've spoken most of the time talking about sort of effects surrounding the human body, around the performance, and of course, and Ava, and that's what the film kind of wants us to do, which is absolutely fine. But there's certainly in the opening section, there's lots of moments where like computers are on display, not even sort of in an overt, explicit way, but a way of cluing us in that this is a near future is these sort of futuristic LED machines that are all around everywhere, and it brought me back to a conversation Chris and I had on the podcast when we did Tron, actually, I believe, about sort of CGI or digital technology representing itself on screen rather than being used to represent something else. So I wondered if you could just tell our listeners about the effects that went on in making those kind of things, because that's so important to establish that, okay, this is basically our world, and physically, mechanically, things are pretty similar, but digitally, things look much more advanced, and that's where the clue is set up.
I mean, there's not that much in Ex Machina that's not doable now in terms of the way that the rest of the world functions. I mean, the sort of the office at the beginning of the film was Bloomberg's old offices, and all of the monitors that's what they had. I mean, what's on the screens was designed for the film, and was designed based on my laptop, because I was the only raging nerd in the room that actually sort of has terminals and things all over the place with bits of code on every now and again. So there's that aspect to it, and there's a mobile phone, but there's not actually that much in the way of tech.
I suppose they talk about it, and
Yeah,
actually, I suppose a bit at the beginning where when Caleb first received the news that has this golden ticket, and we see a scan of his face, and there's the suggestion that that's actually Nathan following him at that particular moment. But it's talked about, but I suppose we don't necessarily see.
But I think that's a representation for us of the ubiquity of Blue Book and Blue Book's reach into the world. Which is, exactly what many nation states are doing right now to track their population. So the film was 4 years ago. So I guess maybe we were 4 years into the future.
But they're small touches, but they're really important because without them, there isn't that crucial sense of disjunct, that sense of the fantastic, where this is very close to our world, but it is not our world. So take a step back and be a bit more critical, I guess, of anything of it.
Well, I suppose it doesn't also set up this idea of kind of network. If the film is all about relationships, then the film sets up a different kind of networked relationship, because that's really important to then establish how Caleb becomes disconnected from that kind of plugged-in world when he talks about. Well, I think he has no phone signal when when he arrives. He has no phone signal. He's geographically dislocated from a technological environment that he's set up to inhabit, and then he becomes transplanted.
The phone is interesting. So we had to design the phone for the film. They used a phone on set that the phone company decided they weren't allowed to use afterwards, so we had to replace it with a CG phone.
So that's a different kind of effect.
Exactly. But what that meant was that we could design a mobile phone where the camera on the front is bigger, which does two things. One, it definitely pushes the HAL 9000 button because you recognise that lens and all of the rest of it. So again, there's another kind of little cultural thing that subliminally will go into people's heads. And the other thing is that from a practical standpoint, here is a phone branded with the name of this company, which clearly is a lot about gathering information. So there's a lot of design choices which are made to help serve that underlying narrative.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, but I'm wondering, just as a final, I could talk to you for hours, but is there a particular sequence in the film, scene in the film, moment in the film, in a film that's all about micro expressions and the analysis of micro expressions and what to think? Is there a moment in the film that you are particularly proud of, or a particular scene in the film that you are that I can remember what I was doing when I was working intently on that? Is there a moment in the film that you are particularly sort of proud of?
I think the scene where Ava gets dressed for the first time is a really beautiful piece of filmmaking, and it's a fantastic performance in the way that for that scene Rob handheld the camera, so there's an intimacy to that. The nature of the visual effects work was very complicated because not only do we have to create a digital robot, but also we have to do all the clothing around the backside because you can see through the limbs, so you need to see the inside of the stocking and that kind of thing. So that aspect of it was challenging and rewarding when it worked. And I just think it's for me it's a pivotal moment in the film because it's the first time you get prodded to actually confront your feelings about whether you think she has humanity or doesn't. And it's done through the medium of clothing, which is such an important method by which we all in our day-to-day lives say a lot about ourselves, whether we consciously think about it when we're trying to find something in the morning to put on or not. The truth of the matter is that our clothing says a lot, and it's not something that is often thought about unless you're a costume designer. So to have that scene in the film do that job really resonated very strongly with me.
Yeah, I suppose because it splits, plays with the issue of gender and sexuality and the performance of those, or the performance of gender, but also, as you say, in a film that's very vocal and dialogue of it's a scene that's played silently, and I think that's a key.
To play the Luddite on the podcast, which is usually my role, so we're talking about the scene at the end where she's sort of her skin is
no earlier on when she gets dressed.
The first time she puts clothes on and she's
right, yes, okay, right,
and she's kind of pulling
she's kind of pulling these very soft
materials over quite smooth, but in these industrial images. And it's the first time you see her as, I don't know, I don't know what that word is. The first time you see her as a form that she takes, that perhaps is also the first time that she is completely attractive to Caleb. I don't know, but she then displays herself, or she is displayed by the film, and within that she is displaying herself to him, and they have an interview or a conversation about the way that she looks, I believe.
We haven't really talked too much about the sort of technical process, so maybe just to use that scene as an example, usually if you can explain it to me, then listeners will get it, hopefully, which is that, so what's going on there? You've got a photograph performance of Alicia putting on a costume, and you have to replace that with Ava putting on a costume.
Yes. So throughout the film, Alicia is wearing a bodysuit that's made out of the same material, the same grey meshed material that you see in her shoulders, and around her groin and her backside, and that. It means that we then know where we are going to have to replace with CG. So part of the design process of Ava was we put these sort of rubber O-rings, I guess you call them, around her wrists and around the tops of her arms and around her ankles. And in narrative terms, their function is to be something that when she puts skin on at the end, the skin can anchor itself to. For our production purposes, they give us a good line to work with, because we say, okay, everything that's the hand side of the O-rings we're keeping as Alicia's actual hands, and everything the other side we are going to have to replace with CG. So the first thing that we do is we duplicate what the camera is doing, so that's called camera tracking. So we now have a virtual camera in 3D computer space that does exactly the same thing as Rob's camera. We then take our mannequin, our armatured model of Ava, and frame by frame we position her, we copy Alicia's performance and we position our armature in exactly the same places. We then rotoscope, which is to draw around the bits that we want to keep, so that would be the face, the hands, the feet, and the clothing in this particular instance. And then we create our digital version of the robot, and in every single setup we would make sure that we photograph the positions of the lighting on set so that we can recreate all of the lights that Rob had. We then have a robot, and now what we are missing is the backside of the clothing, be it the sort of the dress or the stockings in particular, where she's pulling them up her legs, because her legs you can mostly see through. So we had to create a digital version of the stockings to do the inside of the stockings as you see her pull her up, and we have to do a CG version of her hand for that shot, because you can see her hand through her leg, but obviously you can't see Alicia's hand through her real leg. So in that particular instance, that is a bit of animation, because we didn't know what her hand was actually doing, so we had to animate the hand to do something believably handy at that point. So it's a colossal amount of work for what is not a big visual effectsy, shouty, everything exploding-y moment, which is one of the other things I love about the film, is we are, in visual effects, not often asked to do things that are elegant. So it's a treat when you can, with our work and our artistry, actually make something that is delicate and quite exquisite.
And the labour intensity of that moment, did that, because it sounds like you did a lot of work pre-production to try and sort of create a synergy between what's going on visually and narratively and what you need it to happen technically.
Yes, absolutely.
So does that moment come out and you go, okay, that's just a moment in the script that's going to have to be labour intensive because it's going to have to be, or was it one of those, oh, we forgot about that bit moments?
Well, there weren't that many we forgot about that moments, because we had enough time in pre-production to really think through everything.
Yeah.
I was expecting the rendering, the sort of the creation of the images to be more taxing to create something that photographically blended into the set than it ended up being. And I think the reason why it went better than I was expecting was because we were able to accurately capture the lighting for every single setup, so we had a bit of a leg up there. The body tracking side of it, as in the duplication of Alicia's performance, was harder than I thought, because your natural assumption, I think, is that you might think that if someone's moving around a lot, that must be harder to duplicate because there's more movement. It's actually not true. The hardest thing is when someone's standing still, because no one is actually standing still. Humans can't do standing still. So everyone is ever so slightly, subtly shifting. And because we need to make sure that all of the robotic parts are anchored to an actual hand that is just gently shifting in space, that duplication of performance has to be absolutely sub-millimeter perfect. And that was astonishingly challenging. And we had a brilliant team that, over the course of post-production, just became utter experts at that. And by the end of it, there would be nobody else in the world who would be able to touch them at doing that kind of work. I mean, it was spectacular.
Yeah.
I have one more impossible question for Andrew, but do you have any?
No.
Chris?
Go for it. No, go for it.
Okay, so I've never met an Oscar winner before. Do you get a goodie bag, and what's in it?
No, and therefore nothing at all.
Well, that's disappointing. The fantasy is crushed. I've heard all these stories of iPods in.
I think you need to be more famous and prettier than
do
I
you?
am to get that. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, on that bombshell, Andrew, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about a film that I'm still thinking about. We'll continue to think about both now and between now and when the podcast actually comes out. But thank you very much for joining us to talk about your work. We would normally end with a sort of what's coming up, things, where can people find you? So, yes.
Well, if you want to find me, probably the best place is Twitter. I'm at Andrew RJW. I'm currently working on a television series called Devs, which is with Alex Garland again. And that's coming out on FX in the States, and I'm not sure on what other networks worldwide next year at some point.
What's the pitch for that, if you can tell us it?
Or is it under lock and key?
Well, it's again set in a slightly futuristic San Francisco tech community, and if you like Ex Machina, I think you will like Devs.
Terrific.
If Ex Machina is exploring a big philosophical idea, i.e. human consciousness through the medium of technological near-future sci-fi, Devs is doing something similar with a different philosophical conundrum.
We will be sure to check it out.
Yeah.
You can find us at fantasy-animation.org or on Twitter at fananimresearch, FANANIM research, as well as on Facebook, where you can comment on what we've got to say, leave us some feedback, and perhaps suggest some future episodes. If any budding visual effects artists are inspired by what they've heard here, write a blog post for us. You can contact us via the website, and we'd love to hear from you. But for now, this has been Fantasy Animation. I've been Alex Sargent.
I have been Chris Holiday.
And continue to will
I
be,
always,
hopefully. Philosophically, who knows?
Yes.
We're always in a process of becoming.
We are. I will be individuated as Chris Holiday for the foreseeable future.
Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.